In the introduction to this video series, start there if you haven't seen it yet, I described a problem that the contemporary US left faces, its relationship to the Democratic Party and the machinery of bourgeois democracy more generally. Before I get to talking about the specifics of the current debate, it is necessary to examine the history of the Democratic Party in order to better understand its function as an institution in the US state. The Democratic Party isn't some empty vessel that can be piloted by whoever wants to steer it ideologically. It's a highly developed political structure with its own history and specific modes of organization and governance. What I'm going to offer in the first part of this video series is an overview of the history of the Democratic Party from its formative years to the present day. In doing so, I'm not going to go through each presidency or Congress in intensive detail. I'll be talking about the history of the party in terms of periods with somewhat arbitrary demarcations, i.e., Jacksonian democracy, the New Deal, the Great Society, and so on. The history portion of this video series is going to span several videos. I haven't quite worked out how many just yet, but I estimate that each will be roughly 10 to 15 minutes long depending on what I think are the most important issues to highlight. Depending on how they are received, I may make them longer, but for the time being I think 10 to 15 minutes is a good target. What is today known as the Democratic Party was formed in 1792 and was originally called the Democratic Republican Party, changing its name to the Democratic Party in 1824. Throughout this formative period, its composition was varied, but its core was the slave-owning aristocracy, as in its founders, Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. Marxist historian Harry Braverman, writing under the alias Harry Frankel, wrote in 1946 that the Democratic Party, quote, was the political arm of the slaveholders. This was its decisive character. Remaining to be accounted for are the specific configurations of the Jacksonian regime that distinguish it from earlier and later forms of planter rule. For the Democratic Party of Jackson's day reflected an enormous popular ferment that existed at this time in American national politics. This period became a turning point in the development of the techniques of class rule in the United States." End quote. A definitive era for the Democratic Party was the presidency of Andrew Jackson, 1829 to 1837, who would become infamous for his implementation of the genocidal Indian Removal Act of 1830, which would lead to the horrific Trail of Tears, among other atrocities against indigenous peoples in North America. Jackson, before becoming president, had in fact built his reputation as a killer of indigenous people in the military, commanding a Tennessee militia starting in 1801. The Democratic presidency of James K. Polk, 1845 to 1849, oversaw the westward expansion known as Manifest Destiny, including the seizure of sovereign indigenous lands from northern Mexico and the Oregon Territory, further implicating the Democratic Party in the history of settler colonialism. The antebellum, that is, pre-Civil War, era also saw the Dred Scott Supreme Court ruling in 1857, which ruled that a black man has no rights that a white man is bound to respect, and upheld the Fugitive Slave Act, allowing slave owners to hunt down escaped slaves, even in states where slavery was outlawed. The Democratic Party built its base on a demagogic and sometimes even vaguely anti-capitalist sentiment. The rift between the business elites of the North, represented by the Federalist Party at first, then the Whig Party, and finally the Republican Party in 1854, and the plantation owners of the South would form part of the basis of class conflict which precipitated the American Civil War. This Jacksonian Democratic Party, while acting in the interests of the Southern slaveholders, rallied independent farmers, immigrant workers, and small business owners into a populist coalition. But contrary to this supposed quote-unquote populism, quote, the Democratic Party's professed egalitarianism was for whites only. Its commitment to slavery and racism was blatant in the North as well as the South. At the other end of the social scale, Democratic leaders in New York included many bankers and merchants who had nothing in common with the Irish-American masses in the tenements except their allegiance to the same party. End quote. After the U.S. Civil War and the failure of the Reconstruction reforms in the 1870s, the Democratic Party remained the bulwark of segregationists and Southern big business interests. This general alignment of class forces along the lines of the two-party system more or less held until the stock market crash of 1929 and subsequent Great Depression. In the years between the end of the Civil War and the Great Depression, however, there was a growing socialist and labor movement in the United States. This video isn't going to go into great detail on the history of the socialist movement in the US, although perhaps I will cover some of that history in future videos, but I do want to cover how the Democratic Party on many occasions throughout its history either elbowed socialist parties and movements out of the way or tried to co-opt them. An early example of this was the People's Party towards the end of the 19th century. Quote, "In the period up to 1891, the Farmers' Alliance acted as a protest organization that organized small farmers to challenge aspects of the existing tenancy system. It also dabbled in local electoral experiments, creating or supporting campaigns and demanding a combination of reforms ranging from the expansion of paper money, greenbackism, to legal equality of labor and capital, independent of the two major parties. In 1891, activists within the alliance pushed for the formation of an independent People's Party, the Populists, that included representatives from the Knights of Labor and the Colored Farmers Alliance." End quote. The People's Party started to gain a major following in the 1890s as a series of major economic downturns shook many working-class people's faith in either the Democratic or Republican parties to serve their interests. One of the biggest national moments for the People's Party was the 1892 presidential election, in which their candidate James Weaver won 8.5% of the popular vote and secured 22 votes in the Electoral College. At risk of losing huge sections of their voting base to the People's Party, the Democratic Party scrambled to take the wind out of their sails. Quote, "Just when the Populists appeared to be on the verge of remaking national politics, two things happened. First, the Democrats changed their rhetoric to weaken the Populists' appeal. 'Anything you can do to soft-soap the alliance will go down in your interest,' said a leading Democratic contender for the Kentucky gubernatorial nomination. The Democratic nominee pledged to get tough on the Louisville and Nashville Railroad. Second, with the Democratic Party facing extinction in whole swaths of the country, some Democratic politicians decided that regaining political footing required that they co-opt some of the populist program. And for this, they chose to advocate the most innocuous part of the populist program, the demand for a free coinage of silver. Legions of silver Democrats were born." End quote. As this crop of Democrats embraced at least some of the People's Party's program, some within the People's Party advocated fusionism, that is, to liquidate themselves into the Democratic Party. By 1896, the People's Party had effectively done this, despite the old guard of the party arguing to maintain independence from the Democrats. Business interests in the silver industry had given money to the pro-fusionists within the People's Party, hastening its demise. William Jennings Bryan, a major figure in the People's Party, snatched the 1896 Democratic presidential nomination from the unpopular President Grover Cleveland, but lost to Republican William McKinley in the general election. This ushered in about 16 years of uninterrupted dominance of the U.S. presidency by the Republican Party. The Democratic Party would not retake the presidency until the 1912 election of Woodrow Wilson. This pattern of Democrats sabotaging the left, even at their own expense, will be a recurring theme throughout this video series. Describing the changing dynamics of the Democratic Party between the end of the Civil War and the Great Depression, Marxist historian Charles Post writes, quote, "In the South, the Democrats remained the party of the Southern planter class, the party of Jim Crow racial segregation, disenfranchisement, and lynching. In the North, the Democrats were the party of urban real estate developers, immigrant capitalists, and small business owners. While the Democrats relied on the votes of a mostly immigrant working class to win elections in the North, the Dixiecrats were secure in their regional dominance through the exclusion of African Americans from the electorate. The domination of the Dixiecrats, immigrant capitalists, and corporate moderates guaranteed that the liberal labor coalition within the New Deal Democratic Party remained a captive junior partner. Not surprisingly, the Democrats had shed any residual resistance to U.S. global domination in the early 20th century and led the U.S. entry into World War I in 1917." End quote. In the next video, I'll be discussing the first part of the 20th century, with a special focus on the New Deal and Franklin Roosevelt's presidency. See you then! As always, links to my sources are in the video description. I encourage everyone to read them if you have the time and resources to do so. Feel free to drop a comment if you think I missed something important or got something wrong. I've tried to cover as much as possible in the relatively short amount of time afforded by this format, so naturally I will have glossed over some things. So if there's additional information you think is worth knowing, please leave a comment. The background music was by Anonymous420, used under the Creative Commons license. Thanks for watching. If you want to support this project, please click like and subscribe, and if you have any thoughts or questions, leave a comment. I keep all my videos and other work free of advertising and sponsored content, so if you'd like to help me keep building this project, please subscribe to my Patreon at patreon.com/aworldtowin, and follow me on Twitter at aworldtowin1. I'd like to thank my patrons, Greg, Emma Brophy, N. Non-Applicable A, Patrick Hamilton, Holly Irons, and Joan E. Mullinax.